Welcome to Intersect, where church meets culture. My name is Josh Desch, and I'm the lead pastor of Northeast Presbyterian Church in Columbia, South Carolina. And I am joined, as always, by my delightful and polished wife, Betsy.
Ooh, polished.
Betsy, you are looking quite stylish and polished.
Thank you.
Almost like you're a political consultant.
Well, you know.
If the shoe fits.
Never know. Yeah.
Okay, folks, we are recording this on November 6th, so this is the day after the election. Mm-hmm. And Betsy, you look very presidential.
Well, I did stay up. I only stayed up till 12:30 watching the returns. So yeah. I did get some beauty rest, but it was a pretty interesting night.
It was. And I was anticipating a later final call. Like, I didn't think we were going to know yesterday, but you made it later than me. And folks, we are so very excited with the guest that we have today. He is a return guest, and he really doesn't need any introduction, but we have Mr. David French joining us today. David, thank you so very much.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, folks, we are going to hear something of David's story here. The title for this podcast episode is David French, My Journey as a Christian to the New York Times. And this is something that, David, for many of us who have been following you, reading your work, it's been fun for those of us to go a little bit on this journey with you. And we wanted to hear from you. How did God lead you to this place? But before we get there, just to remind our audience a little bit about you. Folks, David French is a writer in the opinion section of the New York Times. He is also an attorney. He has served our country in the Iraq War, and he is a father, a loving father, husband, and Memphis Grizzlies fan.
Oh, the biggest. If this is video, you can see right behind my shoulder is a picture of John Morant dunking a basketball. But I also have to compliment you because it never occurred to me in all my list of compliments for my wife to say she's polished.
Oh. Yeah, well,
So,
you could add that to the repertoire.
Well,
it's a good compliment. I like that, polished.
Well, Nancy French is a rock star too, and
she's fantastic.
And our audience knows that as well. So, David, but you know what? My favorite thing about you is that you love Jesus, and that that like us, like Betsy and I, you are a follower of Christ. And so, jumping right into this topic. David, growing up, did you envision yourself writing for the New York Times? Was this what you wrote in your journal when you were 6? One day I'll write for the Times. Was this a lifelong dream? Let's get into your biography. How'd you get here?
Oh, most definitely not a lifelong dream. If you were going to say, when I was growing up, what did I want to be? I can sum it up. I wanted to be Iceman from Top Gun. Okay,
yeah.
Not Maverick. Okay, because I'm more of a rule follower. And so I always, in that great confrontation, that great square off in Top Gun between Iceman and Maverick, I wanted to be Iceman. And no, I wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. That was my childhood dream. And then when I got into college, my eyes weren't good enough. There were, things that came up and I didn't do it. And so then by my junior year, you're going to get a theme here. And the theme here is, I don't really know what I want to do in life, but I'm going to make a choice that expands my options. And so I was a junior in college and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was graduating from with a political science, graduating with a political science degree from a small Christian college called Lipscomb University, where I teach now. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I took the LSAT, the law school test, as just to kind of see if I would do well. And I thought about law school as an option expanding choice. And what's interesting is after I got into law school, every career decision that I made after that had a very similar progression. And that was, when I left law school, I started as a commercial litigator, but I also got a very keen interest in the First Amendment when I was in law school, because this was an era of a lot of shout downs, acts of intimidation against dissenting students, early 1990s, sort of the first age of political correctness. And so I saw a lot of efforts to silence opposition and silence dissenting voices. So I got involved in First Amendment work. I think my first case I volunteered on might have been my 1L year, my first year in law school. And then as I became a commercial litigator right out of law school, I always had a First Amendment hobby. And the First Amendment hobby got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I had to choose whether or not I was going to continue to be a commercial litigator or be a constitutional litigator. And then I chose to become a constitutional litigator. And that part of my life consumed much of my professional career, but at the same time, I was writing about my cases because I got very frustrated that the media didn't cover my cases, and I thought in a way that was fair or accurate. And so I began writing about my cases. And then just as I had a commercial litigation career with a First Amendment hobby, soon I had a First Amendment career with a writing hobby. And so each thing sort of kind of led to the other, to the point where by 2015, after I'd practiced for 21 years as a litigator, I was ready to try writing full time. And so I called Rich Lowry, who was then running National Review. I used to place a lot of pieces. I was a very regular contributor to National Review. I called Rich and I said, "Do you want more of my stuff?" And he fortuitously said, "I was just thinking, I want more of your stuff." And so in April 2015, May 2015, I joined National Review and became a journalist full time. And funny thing is, I became a journalist full time in May 2015. In June 2015, Trump, announces for president, and it really does change, regardless of your feelings about him, one way or the other. It really did change very quickly, very rapidly. The whole landscape of conservative media began to change in that very moment. And so what I thought I was joining as sort of a conservative media landscape was not what I thought it was. And that sort of then began its own series of adventures. But I think that one of the core elements of my career has not been one of very deliberate planning from point A to point B to point C to point D, but it has been much more one of sort of pursuing my passions, pursuing the things that I strongly believe God was calling me to do, and then being open to the new things or the new opportunities that could emerge.
Love that. So many things I want to say right now. I'm super interested if you see 2015 as kind of the end of some of the neoliberal conservative movement and all this, but I want to go back to your biography. And Betsy, of course, we want you to jump in anytime with what you're thinking. But David, I know that like us, and I'm the pastor of a PCA church, you are a theologically conservative person. And those of us who are theologically conservative, or maybe an even older word would be orthodox. Orthodox, right. Not in the capital Eastern Orthodox sense, but theologically orthodox, Nicene Creed, Apostles' Creed. I know that you believe in the sovereignty of God. I know you believe in God's providence over all things that come to pass. And you mentioned one example with Rich Lowry, but where are those? Maybe some other instances will come to mind of where you've seen God's providence to guide you to where you are today. Because I was guessing that you were going to say, "Yeah, I didn't always dream about writing for the New York Times," but
no.
but we believe as Christians we have this thing about God's providence and that He is ordering all things. So I'm guessing, and you could get into your testimony if you want a little bit, that you've been walking with Jesus for a long time. You've been a follower of Christ for a long time. How have you seen His providence moving your career along?
That's a very good question. And I think that I have seen His providence working in some interesting ways through, believe it or not, what I've kind of consistently thought of as one of my flaws. And so here's what I mean by that. Prior to becoming a journalist, I was always a kind of restless person. If I had a job as a commercial litigator, I had my eye on something else. And if I was doing that something else, I would have my eye on trying something different. So I very quickly skimmed through my life story or my career bio, but I went from a commercial litigator to teaching law school at Cornell Law School, back to being a commercial litigator, joining the Army in 2005, getting an age waiver, serving in Iraq for a year, almost a year, serving in the reserves for from 2006 to 2014. Then at that same time, by the next year of 2015, then moving into journalism. So there was a lot going on, and I'll be very honest with you. For a long time, I thought, I think there's a deficiency in my character that I am looking to try new things all the time. That I constantly am sort of thinking, okay, is there something else that I can do? And for a long time, I felt insecure about that. And I had some doubts about that aspect of who I was, because I had other friends that they got a job right out of college, or they got a job right out of law school, and they put their head down and they dedicated themselves to it, and were doing well and were content and had good lives and good families. Whereas I'm kind of zigging here and zagging here. And then when I began to write full time, I realized, no, wait a minute. God in his providence was giving me a lot of different experiences. He was awakening in my spirit a desire to know and experience new things. And it began to lock into place sort of that providential walk as I became a journalist, because I think that one of the things that is a little bit different about my background compared to many other journalists is I spent most of my career outside of journalism. So I had direct experience with the legal controversies that I write about. I have direct experience deploying overseas. I have direct experience in a lot of the things that I talk about. In other words, I'm not reporting about them as much as I have experience with them, if that makes sense. And so what I began to see was this sort of restless heart that in some ways I had worried about. I began to see that was an aspect of who I was that was important to my development as a person. And so, it is very interesting, how when we take the micro look at our lives, often things about us or events can frustrate us greatly, or we can feel that we're not living the lives that we imagined for ourselves, or you name it. But then when you begin to zoom out, you'll often see that some of the frustrations were actually a source of instruction. That some of the things that you might have felt this is not what I imagined, is God saying, well, you didn't have the right imagination. And so for me, it really has been a process of sort of seeing, the scripture, God's the author and finisher of our faith. I mean, he is ordering our steps in so many ways that we don't perceive in real time. And sometimes we even resist in real time. And of course, nothing that I'm saying is sort of a new insight, but it is always different when you have an insight intellectually versus when you have an insight experientially.
Absolutely.
And
That's the truth.
it's when you experience the insight that it really lands.
Mm-hmm. That's so true.
Very cool. So all of these things preparing you to become an opinion writer for the New York Times, and we're heading there. I'll throw out one more, and then I'll let Betsy ask a question here. But I'm just curious, just this one: how has your life changed since you became an opinion writer for the Times? I mean, I think of the Times as the paper of record still in this country. I would think that for many journalists, it is kind of the upper echelon. But I also know that people don't necessarily have to move to New York City anymore. I'm guessing you guys still live in Tennessee?
Yeah, I'm still in Tennessee.
Yeah, you're still.
Absolutely.
So how has your life changed, David, since God opened this door for you to write for the Times?
It's changed more than I thought it would. I'll be honest. It's funny because it was in late 2022 when Katie Kingsbury, my boss, who runs Opinion, came down to Tennessee, and we met, and she offered for me to join the Times, and I said yes. And then right after I joined, I met with A.G. Sulzberger, who's the chairman of the Times, and had a very nice conversation with him. And he said something fascinating. He said, "We're not one of the largest companies in the world. I mean, the Times is a big company. It's a multi-billion-dollar journalistic enterprise, but it's a very big company. But we're not one of the biggest companies in the world, but we are among the most scrutinized.
Mm-hmm.
And so the comment was brace yourself for scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
And when I heard that, part of me thought, and this is the naivete coming in, part of me thought, well, I've been under a lot of scrutiny for a while. I mean, there's been a lot of people have attacked me very aggressively online and in real life for a long time. I mean, you go back to 2019 and there was a piece written called Against David Frenchism by a guy named Sohrab Ahmari, who was the editorial page editor of the New York Post at the time. So I was at the center of a big maelstrom in conservative circles in 2019 over whether my way of doing politics was sort of the way of the past and whether my emphasis on decency was naive and not up for the challenges of the moment. And so I had bore all the scars from all of that. You know, we'd had threats at the house. We'd had people come to that. I mean, it has been really, really rough these last 9 years. And so he said that, and I thought, oh, well, I've had a lot of scrutiny. I didn't know what I was in for. I mean, it's just the scale of the times, the reach of the times is just orders of magnitude. And also the readership of the Times is very different from a lot of other publications. So when you write something about constitutional law in the New York Times, you can be pretty confident that some of the foremost experts in the United States on constitutional law will be reading it. If you write about foreign policy, you know that some of the people who've studied these issues for a lifetime are going to be reading you. And so you both have a larger number of people reading, and you have some of the foremost experts in the world reading at the same time. And so that means your mistakes are much bigger. They're much more magnified. It also means that controversy or anger attached to you is just much bigger. It's much more magnified. Everything is just bigger. But the thing I'm very grateful for is the Times recognizes that. And so I have a team of super talented people whom I work with, who their job is to make my work better. I have a brilliant editor, brilliant fact checkers. Their jobs are to keep me from help me succeed. Don't let me fail. And so there are a lot of checks and a lot of checks and safeguards inside the institution. Doesn't mean we get everything right. One of the most sick feelings you can ever have in the pit of your stomach is when you've worked and you've worked and you've worked on a piece and you fact checked it and you've worked and you've reread it and it goes out into the world and you wake up in the morning to a text message from somebody, an expert, who says, you got this thing wrong. So it makes you almost want to vomit, when that happens, right? So you immediately correct and you apologize and you make sure everything's right. But, what I would say is the level of scrutiny, unless you experience it, it's really tough to kind of comprehend. And it really is related to the fact that people gravitate towards the New York Times. And there's this statement about the Southeastern Conference. Do y'all ever see this commercial? It just means more.
Of course. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's what I would say about the Times. It just means more. The mistakes mean more. When you get it right, it means, just because, not because it's necessarily better than everything else, although I think that my colleagues do remarkable work. It's so big. It has so much reach that there's greater scrutiny, there's higher stakes, and you just really have to absorb that. And by the way, you have to absorb it prayerfully, because you become very well acquainted with your own limitations and your own inadequacies when you're being scrutinized. It's that to that extent. So it just really leads to a lot of prayerful, a lot of prayerful humility and honestly a humble reliance on the help and assistance and advice and counsel of others.
I was going to ask David, we are New York Times subscribers, and I will tell you, Josh knows that one of my favorite things about the New York Times is the spelling bee.
Yeah.
You've got it
And
so
connections
bad.
and Wordle and
Yes,
absolutely.
I
Looking
love-
for a recovery group.
Yeah.
If you know one.
That's one of my favorite parts. I love the spelling bee. I love to see if I can get the pangram every day, and a lot of times I don't get it. But I'm curious about the process that you go through, because I feel like for my own, in my own life, in the creative endeavors that I undertake, so often I feel like I reach a point of block where I can't think of something to move forward with. So how do you come up with your ideas? How do you come up with the things that you want to talk about? I don't know how often you're writing, but it seems like y'all always have something to talk about. And I just wonder if you ever run out of ideas.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So I have a minimum of 2 pieces a week, a newsletter and a column. So you're always having to, think of new things to talk about. However, it's a lower pace. When I was at National Review, I had to write every day, sometimes more than once a day. That is hard.
Yeah,
that is hard.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, that pace, so when you read a lot of writing on the internet, the economics of the internet sort of are more content. And so a lot of this sort of low quality stuff that you see online, or a lot of the things that you see that might be inflammatory or damaging, are often the product of that pace, that relentless pace. You have to have something. You have to say something. And sometimes, when people don't have anything great to say and they have to say something anyway, that leads to poorly thought out pieces, that leads to quick reactions, hot takes, all kinds of things like that. So I'm very grateful that I do not have that mandatory daily pace.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, for whatever reason, a lot of the major controversies in the United States are actually in the areas where I have the most experience. So constitutional law, anytime you're dealing with culture war issues, constitutional law comes into play. We're in the middle of really large religious realignment in this country. And I've spent my entire life in religious institutions. And then I have experience in foreign policy and in the law of armed conflict. Well, between the war in Gaza and Ukraine, all of these things fit within areas of my own experience. So I am blessed to the extent that I would feel very differently if the biggest issues right now were dealing with monetary policy and policy towards Venezuela. Like that's not my area, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it's easier for me because a lot of the controversies are dealing specifically with my area. The other thing, though, is what I have to be better at, to be honest, is I have to be able to say, I don't think I have anything that is particularly salient. We do have the academic freedom that, for lack of a better term, to sort of say, every now and then I don't have a great thought idea to contribute. And so I'm just going to pause. I'm going to just press pause for a minute. But I would say, as a general matter, I've not really struggled with this, in part because the areas of my interest are very much the areas of live controversy in the U.S. And then the other thing is also because there are not many columnists who are also lawyers. And I do have this entire area where I think that many Americans don't understand how important the lower courts are to their lives. And so I'm able to bring into the public square an awful lot of stories that a lot of people would never know or track, in part because of that unique legal or, semi-unique legal background. And so because of the areas of interest, because of that sort of a big gap in coverage, of media coverage regarding the courts, I actually rarely struggle to come up with something to talk about. But I do sometimes. And I think if I didn't struggle, that might be a warning sign that I think I just have too much to say all the time. But I do definitely struggle sometimes.
Great answer. I would love to get a prediction from you before we close. Do you think that lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court will ever change? Isn't that kind of because I know it's kind of in the water right now.
That's a great question. In the short term, no. In the long term, possibly. And the reason why I say in the long term, possibly, is that there's this interesting dynamic where, as a result of just the accidents of retirements and health crises and things like this, it has become very unpredictable how many court appointments a president can make, whether it's 0 to 1 to 3 to. Trump could end up appointing 5 justices to the Supreme Court, whereas Barack Obama, in his 2 terms, whereas Barack Obama had 8 years and he appointed 2. In Trump's first term, he appointed 3. Biden will have appointed 1. And so in these circumstances, that kind of randomness creates a tension in American body politic. Also, at the same time, a lot of Americans are realizing, wait, we don't have this sort of lifetime appointment with also relatively vague codes of ethics means that Supreme Court justices are much less accountable than virtually any other branch of government. And so I do think over time, if the current dynamics persist, and if the Supreme Court remains in the center of the culture war, it will be interesting to see if there would be some groundswell that, hey, look, we want the courts to be independent. We don't want them up for election, but we want there to be more accountability. So stricter codes of ethics and term limits so that there's more predictability. One justice isn't going to stay there for 40 years, for example. And I do think there might be some room for that argument, but not in the short term. Not in the short term.
Yeah.
There's no bipartisan consensus around that idea at all.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I'll keep going here, Bets. But here's one, David, and I think a lot of our audience. Okay, so a lot of us, Betsy, she's from the Midwest. I grew up in the Metro Atlanta area. David, I know you grew up in Kentucky. A lot of us who grew up in the evangelical church, when we hear the New York Times, we think we grew up thinking the big bad New York Times, right? Right, Bets? And a lot of us had Rush Limbaugh in the background, with our parents and everything. And so I'm wondering, I just want to hear you, for people who are theologically, socially conservative, I would think that a lot of people would think, how does David French, how does he work for the Times? Which I don't think it's a controversial statement to say it's a left-leaning publication. The way that the New York Times would see the world would be through a socially liberal standpoint. And here you are, and of course you're not compromising on your faith, but there's also not, I wouldn't think there's a ton of people in the company, or at least writers, who share your perspective on the world. I know there's Ross. Bets and I both really appreciate David Brooks. And also he's got a really interesting journey too, right? About coming to faith. And I'd love to hear that one sometime. But so what's that like? What are the challenges and what are the opportunities to work for the Times? Because I would think that there would be some Christians who would just say, I just don't see how David does it.
I think those folks who have that view, and that's very real. That's a very real point of view. I hear it all the time. How can you do this?
Yep.
I think people who have that point of view would be shocked at how hospitable the Times is, and it has been for me and for others, in people who are people who are, again, using that word, small o, Orthodox Christians. I was listening to David Brooks the other day, and he was saying, look, there are enough, Christians in Times Opinion, for example, where we could practically start a Young Life chapter. There are more Christians at the Times than many people would think. And this is true across American institutions. I mean, anywhere you go, in the heart of Manhattan, in the middle of, the most secular college campus, there's always more believers in Jesus there than you might imagine. My goodness, I talk about my alma mater, Harvard Law School. A lot of people who sort of look at Harvard and hate it would be shocked to know that there is a Center for Biblical Legal Studies at Harvard Law School, run by my dear friend Ruth Akediji, a absolutely spirit-filled, Bible-believing Christian who runs a Center for Biblical Legal Studies at Harvard Law School. So what I would say is, I feel like so many of us approach secular institutions from a kind of a defensive crouch. I don't feel like that at all. I feel like we should walk into secular institutions with an open heart. And what I have found, I like you, I listened to Rush Limbaugh, but I also always read the New York Times. I listened to conservative talk radio and watched Fox News. I always read the Washington Post. And I never saw the New York Times in the way a lot of my fellow conservatives did, as some sort of implacably hostile institution. I saw it as one that definitely had a sort of, if the median point of view at the Times is pretty, I would say, well to my left, right? It's more secular than my community here in Franklin, Tennessee. But I always admired the work of the Times, especially I found the work from foreign correspondents, war correspondents. I mean, there's just an enormous amount of courageous journalism that takes place. And a lot of people don't realize how much your favorite journalistic enterprise, whether it's even right-wing enterprises, they rely on New York Times reporting all the time, all the time. And so just the level of excellence, the quality of the reporting, look, I'm biased. I just think it's just very, very good. It's not perfect. So this is one of the things I often challenge people to say, well, the New York Times is, they're super biased. I'll say, tell me specifically what you're concerned about, specifically. And then often it sort of falls apart, because a lot of what we're dealing with is people who are telling folks on the right, the New York Times, don't read the New York Times, don't like the New York Times. But then if you actually read the news, many times people are just pulled in, because the actual the quality of the news reporting is just very, very, very good. Just go and look at this reports from Ukraine. At one point we had just this incredible report that was hearing about the first few months of the Ukraine war from this perspective of Russian soldiers.
Yeah.
Through text messages, emails, social media posts, getting their perspective on it. Absolutely riveting and fascinating and informative. So I would say to a lot of Christians, quite unfortunately, I think, approach a lot of secular institutions from the standpoint of a defensive crouch. They feel like their threat response is triggered.
Yeah.
I hear that. And I also, part of what's motivating that question is, in a news environment where there's so much fragmentation now, and there's so many alternative institutions, there's the Daily Wire, there's a lot of other places that Christians can go. I love hearing you say, don't write off institutions that don't perfectly align with where you're coming from as an Orthodox Christian. Come in with an openness, because there are so many options now with different sources of media. Even at the same time, I'm sure you just saw this stat, 7% of all journalists in America now work for the Times, because all the little papers have gone out of business.
That's amazing. Now, I would strongly urge listeners, do not limit yourself to in-group media. If you limit yourself to in-group media, you will have major blind spots. You will. And so it is difficult to encounter. It is difficult to encounter reporting. It is difficult to encounter opinion that runs contrary to your preconceptions, runs contrary to your worldview. There's some interesting research, and I quote this, that I've talked about this in my book about American divisions, that I was talking to someone who's an expert in identity-based conflict. And what she said is, when people are deeply partisan, if you experience a negative fact, not a negative argument, not just a negative argument, but a negative fact, a fact that cuts against your arguments, a lot of people experience an involuntary fight or flight response. Like literally physiologically, they recoil from negative information. You have to fight through that. So what often ends up happening is we receive negative information, we recoil from it, and we code that recoil as sort of like, well, I've considered it and rejected it. What we're really actually encountering is something that might just be uncomfortable. And sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. And so that's why I strongly urge people And I actually gave this advice to somebody the other day. They said, what do you say to somebody who just totally distrusts the mainstream media? I said this: pick a mainstream publication. It could be the Times. It could be the Wall Street Journal. It could be the Washington Post. And spend a month and do not read opinion. This is cutting against my self-interest because I'm an opinion columnist. Mm-hmm. Do not read the opinions. Only read the news for a month. And I'm going to guess that you're going to emerge from that month more well-informed with a higher opinion of the newspaper. And then you can start to introduce the diet of opinion into your consumption. I think opinion journalism is very important. But if you want the gateway drug to journalism is the hard news reporting. That should be and so, and the other thing is, I just strongly, I have two sort of rules that I try to apply for myself to keep myself from having blind spots, because we're all fallen. We're all imperfect. We're all going to have blind spots. So how do I try to address my blind spots? And I do it in two ways. One is I try to read the best expression of the other side's point of view. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So don't pick out somebody who's malicious, ignorant, making dumb arguments, because it'll just make you feel great about yourself, right? True. Look how bad and dumb those people are. No, pick out the smartest person, the wisest person, the people who make the best arguments, and follow them. And two things are going to happen. One, you're going to learn something. And two, it's going to humanize your opponents, because you're going to get an actually better window into their soul than by reading some of the worst stuff. The other thing is, when you encounter a new and challenging idea, read the idea's proponents before you read the idea's opponents. So what ends up happening a lot of times is we'll encounter something that we don't know about that sounds very challenging, that sort of disrupts a lot of our preconceived notions. And then we'll go, who can I read to tell me why this is wrong? Because we want that immediate reassurance, right? Mm-hmm. So, what does so-and-so say about critical race theory? Like a trusted conservative columnist. No, go read a critical race theorist and then go and read the opposition. So get the steel man version before you sometimes read what often turns into a straw man version. And so at all times, look out and seek out that best expression of the opposing point of view. And it will complicate your life. I'll just go ahead and tell you.
Yeah, that's right.
It's going to complicate your life. It's going to make things feel a lot less easy. It's going to make you feel a little bit more uncertain. But my goodness, I feel like that's where we should be. Micah 6:8, act justly, love kindness, walk humbly. I think one of the big steps to walking humbly is reading very, very smart people who scramble your preconceptions. Mm-hmm.
I love that.
I love it. I feel like it's a call to faith too, right? I mean, the Christian life is not one of constant certainty all the time. Oh, I mean, goodness no.
And interestingly, I think that constant certainty is a terrible witness. Because here's what ends up happening when you're constantly certain. You're going to encounter a person who's going to be able to tell within 9 seconds the emperor has no clothes. and as soon as that happens, as soon as your certainty encounters their knowledge and you are exposed, that's bad for you. That's bad for you. It's bad for your cause. That certainty then becomes incredibly counterproductive. It calls the rest of your credibility into question. But if you approach a complicated subject with a spirit of curiosity first, so when I'm encountering people who I know have a point of view different from mine, I reverse the Micah 6:8 order. I try to walk in with humility, meaning with a spirit of curiosity. What is it that you believe? I try to establish kindness in the relationship through the spirit of curiosity, through respect for them as I hear their views. But then I don't leave my own views out of it. That's when I then bring in what my own view and my own understanding of justice is in this circumstance. And that doesn't always lead to productive conversation. Sometimes people have hearts that are so hard that just the mere knowledge that you're ultimately going to disagree with them means that they're going to lash out at you with cruelty and anger. But in most circumstances, even in this highly divided country, if you enter into the conversation with a spirit of curiosity, show concrete and very real kindness to people, you'll be amazed at how much you can talk about and interact over competing ideas and values around justice.
That's really good stuff.
Well, David, we love what you're telling us about how to live out our faith, Micah 6:8, how to engage institutions that come at life from a different perspective. And we also have a topic that's almost as important, which is the TV show The Rings of Power.
Yes.
More important.
I'm so tempted to ask you before we get there, and I'm because I had to tease it for the audience. But I'm just curious, and maybe this is just a yes or no. Are you worried about young men right now in America? I know I'm a dad. I've got 2 sons, 17 and 15. There's Richard Reeves. There's all this stuff coming out about men right now. I'm just curious. Do you have a level of concern with the place that young men are right now? And it could be because of all sorts of macro trends going on. We know about the rates of who's going to college, who's not going to college, all this stuff. But I know that's something that for me as a father, as a man, and as a pastor, it's on my heart to think about the discipleship of young men. And I'm just curious, is that something that's resonated with you in the last couple of years?
For years, it has resonated with me. For years. So I've been writing about the issue of the crisis in American masculinity for the better part of a decade. And it's actually an evolving challenge right now. It's an evolving challenge. So if you were talking about, say, rewind the clock 6-7 years ago, you had this real emphasis on parts of the American left where they were challenging traditional masculinity as inherently toxic.
Yep.
And so you saw this in the American Psychological Association, where they were talking about traditional masculinity ideology as dangerous or harmful. And I thought that was dangerous or harmful to say that, quite frankly, because to say to men, because they were looking at certain characteristics of men that are sort of stereotypically male that might be disproportionately found in men. Aggression, for example, some kinds of ambition, physicality. There's just different things that you would say, not exclusively male, but disproportionately male. And, there are other values and virtues and characteristics that are not exclusively male, but are disproportionately female. And to say to young men, if you had an orientation towards physical courage, if you had an orientation towards that physical world and things like that, that's somehow inherently toxic, it's just wrong. It's one of the reasons why young men began to question who they were and what they were about, because they were in some ways being told that their very nature had to be, there was something fundamentally wrong with their nature, that instead of sort of saying, look, aggression, for example, can be positive or negative. There's the aggression of criminality, but then there is the physical courage and fortitude of virtuous law enforcement, or like the soldiers I served with in Iraq who had demonstrated real aggression towards Al-Qaeda, and I'm glad that they did. And so, a lot of these things are characteristics that can be shaped in virtuous ways or negative ways, right? And so we were telling a lot of men for a long time that your nature, something about your nature, is just inherently wrong. Now, I'm leaving aside for the moment we're all fallen. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the way traditional masculinity was framed. And then the backlash to that created its own new issue, which was sort of like young men saying, oh, you're worried about toxic masculinity. I'll show you toxic masculinity. And you began to see this embrace of people like Andrew Tate and some of these influencers in the manosphere that were essentially saying, oh yeah, all that aggression, dive into that, boys. All of that. And so they were sort of cultivating the most extreme manifestations of it. And so what I've written about, I wrote this thing about and it was a title of a column I wrote some time ago, about the golden masculine mean. In other words, the golden mean, avoiding the extremes of either side, orienting young men to be the highest and best expressions of their nature. And that had to mean shunning both of these extremes. That voice from the Andrew Tates of the world saying, to use the language he uses, you're the top G, your success is going to be measured in money and women. And this is a and don't let them keep you down, versus the other hand, all of that. Do you want to be in the infantry? Do you want to be a law enforcement officer? Do you want to be a firefighter? No, that's all evidence of toxic masculinity. You need to dial that way back. No, shun both of those. And I love, there is this speech given by Admiral William McRaven to the University of Texas graduating class in commencement. This was several years ago. And it's gone down in history as the make your bed speech. And it was not directed only at men, for sure. It was not directed only at men. But if you want a holistic vision of masculinity, one that is both, cultivate the virtues that protect the vulnerable. This is the guy who was in charge of Operation Neptune's Spear, which was the operation that killed bin Laden. No one's going to say that he is some sort of shrinking violet, right? No, you cultivate the virtues that allow you to protect the vulnerable, but that's not all about physicality. It's not all about aggression. It's also about compassion. It's also about tenderness. It's also about grace. And I think that balance there is something that has been missing in the public conversation, because we retreat to our ideological corners and we head towards extremes all the time. Yeah. But look, unless we can take that holistic approach, young men are going to continue to struggle with deaths of despair, struggle with friendlessness, and struggle with economic failure to launch economically, failure to launch socially. So we have to model that holistic view and shun those extremes. But yes, I'm totally with you. I have a son. He's such a great kid. But I have seen in a lot of peer parents, a lot of young men go through this period of they just don't know who they're supposed to be.
Yeah. Yep.
We're gonna link both those things, David. We'll link your article as well as that speech, because I had heard about that. I've never listened to it, but I've heard about it, and that's some wonderful counsel for our audience. Now, switching gears, Betsy, we watched a TV show recently, did we not?
Yes. So a little bit lighter. We are Rings of Power fans. I mean, Josh and I are both Tolkien fans. We've, read the Silmarillion.
Because we love God. Sorry.
Yep.
And we are not those people who say we won't watch the Rings of Power because, it does this or that.
It's not canon. It's not. Yeah. We're not that kind of purist.
No.
Thank you for that, by the way.
Yeah, we've just enjoyed it for the sake of entertainment. I don't know if you've enjoyed season 2 more than season 1. As of time of recording, the airing wrapped up a month ago or so.
Yeah.
So, what's kind of been your impression, David? Did you like season 1 better than season 2? What's your favorite storyline moving forward?
So I loved season 1. Love season 2 even more.
Oh, good.
And there's 2 observations that I have about it. One, for all of those listeners who are like, it's not canon. Yeah. Okay, I get it. But the second, can we just nerd out in the most grotesque way right now?
Let's do it.
Sure.
The second age of Middle Earth was really long. It's the longest. So you have the first age, the Silmarillion. The second age is the period between the Silmarillion and the third age, which the very end of the third age is the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Yep. The second age is this really long period of time, thousands of years. And so there was no way to do a show canon. There's just no way.
It's impractical.
Do you want to have a 1 millennium time jump? I mean, that's a little disorienting. So they had to compress.
Sure.
So my question was, I was not looking for canon. I was looking for canon in the sense of canon on all the beats of the story. I was looking to faithfulness to Tolkien and the Tolkien ethos and the Tolkien aesthetic and all of that. And that, I think, Rings of Power has really delivered. And by the way, if you really are a deep cut Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion person, the portrayal of Galadriel is not in any way a betrayal of her character. Because when you see her in Lord of the Rings, guys, she is old.
Oh, yeah.
In Lord of the Rings. She has learned a lot. But, remember from the Silmarillion, she left with the Noldor when the Silmarils were stolen. And she participated in that whole war against Morgoth. She was a warrior from way back. So this warrior Galadriel is very consistent with the development of her character. And that leads me to, this is why I think that there is a real, that I think that why I'm most invested in the Elvish storyline. Because I think The Rings of Power does something very important that, as much as I love Peter Jackson and Lord of the Rings, he didn't get at. The elves are flawed. You know, you don't really get that concept when you're watching the trilogy or reading the
angel figures, as it were.
They're almost angelic. But if you go all the way back to Silmarillion, there's some hot-headed, prideful folk, right? And a lot of the virtue by Lord of the Rings is hard-earned wisdom as a result of a lot of conflict and failure. And so you see in Rings of Power some of this gullibility, some of this self-doubt, some of this zeal, this pride. If you had to pinpoint the failure of the elves in the Silmarillion, it was pride. And, you know, the pride of the work of their hands, right? And so I feel like in many ways, the story of the elves in Tolkien is a very much, I've long thought of Silmarillion as his most profound work. Because what the Silmarillion ultimately says is, yes, we fallen, flawed people can achieve, by God's grace, his common grace, works of great wonder and beauty, but we are utterly incapable of slaying evil on our own and defeating evil on our own. We're too corrupt for that.
Interesting.
And we have to have the intervention of the light and the high beauty that lays beyond our vision. And you know, that reminds me of that really key moment in Return of the King, where Sam is looking, they're in the end of their rope, right? They're at the end of their rope, and they're stuck in Mordor, and all hope seems lost, and they see the starlight peeking through even into the shadows of Mordor. And he says, there's light and high beauty beyond the shadow's reach. That's the ethos of Tolkien. And if the show shows that, if a movie shows that, it's faithful to it. And I feel like that it does. And it also does something that's quite faithful to Tolkien in showing that the elves had problems.
Yeah.
Elves had problems. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, something Josh and I have talked about is Tolkien doesn't give a lot of details. You know, there's a lot of wiggle room left to interpret how this event happened or that event happened. And so it's almost like the show has filled in the gaps. And, you know, whether or not you like it, I guess that's your own choice. But I don't think it's, you know, I think it's a good thing they've done.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, some of the other storylines, like the Harfoots and everything, they can be a little cheesy at times. But also, I think the actors are pretty charming. The dwarves are a great subplot. Numenor is fascinating as well. I mean, they're trying to layer it's like watching Game of Thrones in a way. There's a lot that's being layered in here, but the Elvish storyline is the beating heart of the story.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've loved season 2. I'm going to be a little bit of a wet blanket for a moment.
Oh, man.
and just, well, I've got to say, and I think the Galadriel lady is killing it. I love her. But what about the kiss with Elrond?
Oh, man.
I mean, come on. I mean, she's married.
In this show, I don't believe that she is.
Okay.
So in canon, she is.
Okay.
In canon, she's...
There we go.
But in this show, from what I have understood, and I could be wrong about this, but the showrunners have teased the introduction of her husband later.
So this is like a prequel kind of
she's
thing.
not married yet.
She's not married yet. Although we know in canon, not only is she married in the Second Age, she's been married for a long time.
Yeah.
And now, what is, you know, if like what's the 25th? I don't know what the diamond anniversary is, but what, you know, 25th anniversary is a big one. 50th is huge.
Right.
What is the 1,000 year anniversary gift?
It's got to be pretty big.
Yeah. Maybe that, I can't remember the husband. Maybe he did. Okay. I want to hear Betsy answer this and David, and then I'll answer it. If you had to be one character in Middle Earth, what storyline would you want to be a part of? Would you want to be a dwarf in Khazad-dûm, a human in Numenor, an elf in Lindon, or a nomadic Harfoot? You got to pick one of those 4.
Wow, we are really getting nerdy here. You know, knowing how a lot of those stories end, I'm not sure which one to pick.
Yeah, boy.
I
Lindon.
guess, yeah. I'm not sure that there's a great option, to be honest. But just for the sake of the argument, I would want to be an elf. So.
Okay.
As appealing as that is, and there's a lot appealing about it, among other things, immense power and immortal life, like that's pretty an appealing part of that storyline. The Numenorian storyline, don't sleep on that. Because it is a storyline that very much is resonant with a lot of our own experiences, which is when you begin to see a society go off the rails, drunk on its own pride, drunk on its own power, who will you be, right?
Interesting.
And there's just a fascinating, a lot of folks, when they think of Isildur and Elendil and all of these folks, they pick them up in the Lord of the Rings, where Elendil dies confronting Sauron at the gates of Mordor. Isildur slices off the ring, but then claims it as his own. And there's sort of this very truncated view. But the reality is, Elendil is one of the great heroes of Tolkien literature. I mean, he's part of the faithful, the people who resisted the demagoguery and the pride and the vanity of ancient Numenor. And so I'm just drawn to those stories where there's a remnant, right? And that's a story of a remnant. And I love that storyline. I think it's a phenomenal storyline. And then how the remnant, in this very biblical way, by the way, and when we talk about remnants in Scripture, there's a loss to it, because a remnant implies there was a once greater, larger whole. But always in Scripture, the remnant is the seed for renewal. Always. And so when you talk about the faithful remnant of Numenor, Elendil, Isildur, that's the seed of the renewal that we saw in Aragorn. And so, that is, to me, that's just a marvelous storyline of persistent faithfulness, generation after generation, and what it can ultimately yield. And so I love that storyline.
I think for me, my favorite part of the whole season was the story between Annatar and Celebrimbor, and just seeing how that developed, and how Sauron deceived the people of Eregion. And man, I thought that actor did such a great job. He just had me wrapped around his little finger. He really did.
Amazing portrayal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, and again, that comes back to that point I said earlier. The elves are flawed.
Mm-hmm.
He played Celebrimbor like a fiddle.
Yes, he did.
Right.
He did.
Yep.
And which Celebrimbor, I mean, again, this is all linked, and they've done such a good job. I mean, Celebrimbor saw himself as the greatest elven sort of creator since Fëanor, who did the Silmarils and Silmarillion, and he was striving for that greatness and that ultimate beauty that he could create. And there's Sauron whispering, in his ear, "You can do it. You can," And I just love how, Tolkien said he did not like anyone to think of his stories as allegory.
Yep.
He did not like, but they were thoroughly Christian works.
Yes, absolutely.
And you just see that truth bleeding through every page.
Amen. I think that portrayal of Sauron is got to be one of the greatest portrayals of evil, because so much of evil is wrapped up in mystery, even in the Word, that I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
Well, this is,
and again,
been
it's
fun.
jolting for Lord of the Rings fans, because they know Sauron is the red eye, like the big eye,
That's
right?
Not a pretty guy with blonde hair.
They don't realize that he spent most of the Tolkien canon as a guy who could present himself in very fair forms, and was a tempter, as we'll see more of.
Yeah, I was going to ask, as just a wrap-up question, what do you hope to see in season 3? Is there anything that you're really gunning for? I don't know when that'll even be, in 2 years or something?
A year and a half, I mean,
okay.
Look, we have a whole part of the Numenorians storyline that has not fully played itself out yet. We have the establishment of the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. We have, we have the last alliance of elves and men. We've got a lot,
there's a lot to
to look
cover.
forward to. So it's going to be just very interesting to see how they do that, because, again, all of that in canon is spread out, pretty substantially. And so they're going to have to compress it. But there's just so much material to work with.
Yeah,
here.
there is.
Amen. Well, Intersect listeners, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, a huge thank you to David French. Of course, you can find him on the New York Times. We mostly read it on our phones, right, Bets? But I guess people still get the paper copies too.
Yeah.
You still write for the Dispatch too, right, David?
No, I
No,
podcast.
Okay. You that's right.
Yep.
Okay.
I have advisory opinions, which, I don't like to brag, but might be. I may be a little biased, but I think it's the greatest legal podcast in the universe. but mainly because of my co-host Sarah Isker. She's brilliant and fun, and if you don't think you would like to listen to a podcast about the law, you would enjoy it because Sarah is just very, very good at what she does.
I have actually listened as a non-attorney and really enjoyed it. He's also got a book, Divided We Fall. Check out that book. But David, just thank you for your service to Jesus, your faithfulness to him. We know you're a sinner like everybody else. You don't get everything right, but hey, we don't either. And we're thankful that you were willing to come on the podcast today.
Well, thanks so much for hosting me. It was a real delight. Thanks, guys.
All right. Take care. We'll see you next time.